this opportunity to be in this lovely city today, and it is always gratifying to see your students doing so well in life, and that to a teacher is the most satisfying thing. And Dr. Sanjay has proved by this 7th or 8th meeting of that particular fact. Corrosive ingestion is a common problem not only in India but all over the world actually. India, north, south, east, west, wherever there are different reasons for people to consume corrosive acids or alkalis, more often acids in India than in the West. Now I'll just start with a case we had some time ago. A 52-year-old male who swallowed sulfuric acid accidentally under the influence of alcohol. He had taken a lot of alcohol and mistaking sulfuric acid kept at home for more alcohol, he consumed it. That is one of probably 10 to 15% of adult males consume acid or alkali in North India because of being inhabited. So he had taken it 24 hours ago and had come with odynophagia, burning sensation in the chest, hoarseness of voice, had some tachycardia, blood pressure was normal, blood gases were normal, amylase was normal. We look at amylase because it gives you an indication whether there is perforation or not. Chest X-ray and abdominal X-rays did not show air under the diaphragm. And about 12 hours later, he underwent endoscopy, which showed that right from the oropharynx, the vocal cords were edematous, there was hyperemia. When we entered the esophagus, there was spontaneous bleeding, there was submucosal hemorrhages, and there was evidence of scattered necrosis or blackish charring of the mucosa. At the gastroesophageal junction, the charring looked confluent. So this would classify as grade 3B injury, and scattered charring would classify as grade 3A injury. The stomach was full of charring, confluent charring, again suggesting grade 3B injury, and except for the distal-most part of the antrum, the rest of the stomach was also charred in a confluent manner, suggesting grade 3B injury. He underwent a CT scan, and which showed, if you look closely, the esophagus at the gastroesophageal junction, just above that, is edematous, and you don't see the lumen. I'm unable to bring up the pointer. But anyway, this is in contrast to a normal esophagus on a CT scan, which is not thickened, and the mucosa, the innermost layer, is dense, hyperdense. So again at the G junction you had edematous mucosa with contrast not being taken up by the mucosa. The stomach wall also was thickened, again in contrast with a normal CT scan of the stomach. The wall is much more thickened, loss of fat plane, plus non-uptake of contrast. So this was suggestive of grade 3 injury on CT scan also, and then he underwent esophagogastrectomy. So this is an extreme example of corrosive injury who underwent surgery and recovered within a week out of that. So there are patients who should require surgery in the immediate post-endoscopy or post-investigative phase to salvage them. Otherwise, this patient would have perforated in another few days and would have been difficult to manage. So, transmural necrosis was seen involving whole of the esophagus, G junction and stomach, and no viable area was seen. Okay, so corrosive agents normally in children will consume it accidentally. In adults, quite often it is because of suicidal intention or accident. The ravages of corrosive ingestion can be acute, chronic or concomitant. I've showed you one example. This is another example of severe charring, a patient who required esophagogastrectomy. Chronic phase, you can have strictures which can be very difficult to, even pass a guide wire like the hair, or you can have cicatrization of the stomach, which used to be subjected to surgery earlier. Late sequelae carcinoma developing in after corrosive ingestion is not very uncommon. However, most of the cases reported from the West are after alkali ingestion. In India, most of the patients have acid ingestion, and probably this complication is not as common. We have had only 5 cases in the last 25 years. So it is not only that you have injury to esophagus and stomach. Because of injury to the lower end of the esophagus, the vagus nerve gets entrapped, and you can have gallbladder emptying, which is delayed, and with a possible likelihood of development of gallstones. You can have gastric emptying, which is delayed. You can have orocecal transit, which is slowed down, leading to bacterial overgrowth. And we have also seen that acid output in such patients is reduced. Gastric acid secretion is reduced, and sham feeding induced acid secretion is reduced, suggesting that it is the vagus nerve which is, particularly if the injury is localized to the lower end of the esophagus. So vagal dysfunction is common in such patients. So such patients do not require PPIs or H2RA when we are treating their esophageal strictures. So as corrosive agents with pH below 3, that is acids, strong acids, or pH above 11, that is alkalis, are the commonly attributed agents which cause injury, and extremes of pH will cause more severe injury. It has been seen that more the concentration of a strength of the corrosive agent, or more the contact time of the corrosive agent, more deep is the injury or more severe is the injury, and that is why solids cause more severe injury. Solids are generally alkalis which some people ingest accidentally. So pathogenesis: alkalis cause liquefaction necrosis, acids cause coagulation necrosis, and it was believed that there is difference between the involvement of esophagus, but it has been seen that both acids and alkalis, the overall mechanism remains the same, that there is necrosis, ulceration. Within 3 weeks there is onset of fibrosis which goes on for years, and so about two months after ingestion you can have the onset of fibrosis and stricture formation, and decades later, maybe 3 to 4 decades later, there can be development of carcinoma. Perforation, if it occurs within 24 to 72 hours, or if neglected, in the next 5 to 7 days. In the late 90s, late 80s, we showed that irrespective of the agent being acid or alkali, the esophagus and stomach are involved to the same extent, that is about 85 to 90% of esophagus and 85 to 90% of stomach will get involved, because most patients in India consume concentrated acids or alkalis. So irrespective of the pathogenetic mechanism, it is the concentration of the acid or alkali which is responsible for involvement of esophagus and stomach. There is no sparing of esophagus with acids or of stomach with alkalis. Stricture formation is also similar with both acids and alkalis. So one must not go with the idea that you may have less of stomach involvement with alkalis or with acids. Clinical features of acid or alkali ingestion are common: pain in the oropharynx, drooling of saliva, hoarseness, retching, dysphagia, odynophagia. More sinister symptoms which should be looked for are those of mediastinitis or peritonitis, like retrosternal chest pain which radiates to back, epigastric pain, and emesis of tissue or blood or coffee ground material. These will suggest deeper injury and a likelihood that such patients may have perforation. Now complications, immediate complications are upper GI bleeding, which is reported in about 3% of patients, but at a tertiary referral center we see bleeding in 10 to 15% of patients. I'll come to this aspect a bit later. Fistula formation is up to 3% in the esophagus or sometimes in the stomach. Corrosive aspiration pneumonia is a very dangerous complication, occurs in about 4%. And delayed complications, as I mentioned, you can have stricture formation in the esophagus or stomach and rarely in the oropharyngeal area. This is an example of aortoesophageal fistula, something we haven't had any such case, but tracheobronchial injury is not uncommon, is uncommon but not rare. We have had perforations and fistula formation with the esophagus and the respiratory tract. Now GI bleed, which I mentioned, GI bleed is an important presenting symptom because it denotes severity of the injury and likelihood of immediate or delayed complications. In this study of 106 patients, we saw that endoscopic grading, grade 3 B injury had a odds ratio of 14 for prediction of late complication, whereas presence of hematemesis had an odds ratio of 4, but occurrence of hematemesis as well as melena or requirement of blood transfusion had the highest odds ratio for development of immediate or delayed complication. So any patient presenting with hematemesis and or melena or who requires blood transfusion should be very, very carefully monitored. So how do you manage patients, particularly in the immediate period? Each such patient should be transferred to the hospital, kept nil per oral, airway protection should be instituted, should be put on IV fluid. Whether such a patient needs proton pump inhibitors or not is a very difficult question to answer. Most emergency departments will start a patient on PPIs. However, if the patient can swallow, if you have done endoscopy, then sucralfate is probably something which actually can heal the injury to some extent. You must rule out perforation by X-ray chest, X-ray abdomen and a CT scan. CT scan remains the best modality to pick up perforation. Obviously, you will have hematocrit, pH, renal functions, liver functions and serum amylase. For things which are contraindicated, no patient should have gastric lavage. No patient of corrosive ingestion, acid, alkali, liquid, solid should have gastric lavage. It perpetuates the injury and aggravates the injury. No patient should have anything given to him to induce vomiting. Both these factors can, cause up and down movement of the corrosive substance from the stomach into the esophagus and worsen the injury. So these are absolutely contraindicated. Relatively contraindicated is neutralization. A patient has taken acid, you try to give him alkali, or patient has taken alkali, you give him an acidic, mildly acidic agent, because giving a neutralizing agent will cause thermal injury. So, which is harmful to the patient. Both for acids and alkalis, neutralization is harmful. So, after stabilizing maintenance of airways, you do an endoscopy, which should ideally be done within 24 hours of ingestion. And broadly speaking, you have grade 1, which is edema and hyperemia, grade 2 is ulceration, grade 3 is charring. So grade 2 is split into 2A and 2B. 2A is when the ulcers are scattered and in between you see normal area. 2B is when the ulcers are circumferential. 3A is when the charring is scattered. 3B is when the scarring is confluent. So in the stomach you have scattered ulcers 2A, confluent ulcers 2B, scattered charring 3A and confluent charring 3B. However, endoscopy, the initial endoscopy may not be the best thing to do, because in the beginning, particularly in the first 24 to 48 hours, you can have submucosal hemorrhages which may be, classified as severe injury, because you can mistake these for charring. Then you can have bile reflux, you can have presence of pseudomembranes which can overlook or overgrade or downgrade the injury at the first instance. So we looked at day 1 versus day 5 endoscopy. Here's an example that this patient had submucosal hemorrhages on day 1 endoscopy which looked like charring. On day 5 all these hemorrhages had disappeared and there was just ulceration, that too scattered. So the injury got downgraded from 3A to 2A. A similar example, hemorrhages in the stomach, submucosally as well as into the lumen, and classified as 3A injury, whereas 5 days later all this had disappeared. So if a patient is not having 3B injury, you must relook and have a relook endoscopy on day 5. So endoscopy on day 5 is better, but the implications of endoscopy are that with up to grade 3A injury, you can have conservative management and institute nasoenteral feeding. If the patient has grade 3B injury, he should be considered for Aglik surgery. Recently, CT scan has emerged as a major investigative modality because it can grade injury probably better than endoscopy. And I showed you in the case which I showed you that patient can have severe injury which can be picked up like total edema, loss of fat planes and lack of enhancement of the mucosa, which suggests grade 3 injury. And in a study from France it was shown that 19 out of 120 patients there was a disparity between endoscopy and CT scan, and CT scan was proved to be better, and 19 patients would have been spared of unnecessary esophageal dissections if CT scan was believed rather than endoscopic grading. So currently the algorithm is that after initial resuscitation, you do initial imaging to rule out perforation. If there is no perforation, then you do endoscopy. If the injury is grade 1 to 3A, you put the patient on conservative management, do a relook endoscopy on day 5 and institute feeding. If you have endoscopic evidence of grade 3B injury or patient is not fit for endoscopy or not willing for endoscopy, then you will do a CT scan. If CT shows necrosis or grade 3 injury, you must subject such a patient for surgery as early as possible. That is the best hope for salvage of such patients. If there is perforation, then obviously the patient would undergo surgery in the first instance. How do you institute feeding? In the first endoscopy itself, we place a nasoenteral tube feeding, pass it across, and at 6 weeks remove the tube, and we have seen that maintenance of hemoglobin and weight was better with nasoenteric tube feeding than even with feeding jejunostomy. So after 6 weeks, 8 weeks, you remove the tube, map the injury, map the stricture, and start the patient on dilatation or surgery. So these are the sequelae which we see: strictures, esophagus or stomach. I'll just say a few words about role of steroids. There is no role of steroids in preventing strictures, no role of antibiotics in preventing strictures. Dilatation you do with balloons or with bougies. Balloons are probably easier to use and more so in patients with small stomach with multiple strictures. But overall, Savary dilators have better response. The recurrence is much less than with balloons. How much to dilate? You dilate to 15 millimeters. There is no point in dilating beyond 15 millimeters. The overall response to stricture dilatation is about 65% or 70%. 35% of patients will undergo surgery either in the first instance or later. A word about gastric cicatrization. It opens up much better than esophageal cicatrization. So 90% or 95% of such patients will open up endoscopically, and today we rarely ever subject such a patient for surgery. So to conclude, both acids and alkalis cause equal injury. One must take them as equal in terms of complications, whether immediate or late. Each patient should have early endoscopy, preferably within 24 hours, but you can delay endoscopy. If the patient comes at 3 days or 5 days, you can do an endoscopy up to day 5. Beyond that, there is probably a risk of perforation. A CT scan should be done to compare with endoscopic findings, and a CT scan showing you grade 3 injury is an indication for early surgery. Most patients with grade 2B injury onwards will develop strictures. Esophageal strictures can be endoscopically managed in about 2/3 of patients, whether by dilatation or with stenting. But for gastric cycatrization, probably 90%, 95% of these patients can be treated endoscopically and surgery can be avoided. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the nice presentation and the very nice elaboration and the staging. One thing, sir, the airway management. Being a surgeon, we are involved with these kind of patients quite early in the when patient presents. Airway management is very important part of these patients because you did mention it very briefly. Because these patients normally have a significant amount of aerophageal edema, and airway management is often overlooked probably, and these has to be taken into consideration. Second is the feeding part. You mentioned about feeding NJ, early feeding NJ view. Now, feeding NJ, we knew that patient is not going to be probably using his own way you do with feeding NJ, but isn't putting in a foreign body through the same area where there is injury can be avoided, and we do laparoscopic feeding jejunostomy early, quite early.
Perioperative feeding jejunostomy. Overall, about 5 to 10% patients would have slippage of the feeding or some local wound-based complications. The advantage of a celastic tube nasoenterally placed gives you one major advantage, that at 6 to 8 weeks, there are patients who have pinpoint pylorus or virtually no lumen visible at the pyloric end. Having a tube in place at the esophagus or in the stomach, when you remove that tube, you will have lumen available to you. So you can start dilatation. There have been instances when we have had patients referred from outside with complete blockage, no lumen in the stomach, and you do a CT scan as just a 5 mm, 4 mm stricture. So which we have tried opening with needle knife or with some special procedures, but we felt that putting in a tube is a better modality than laparoscopic feeding tube, but I would not contest that if that is the practice anywhere.
I just have one comment or maybe a question. Some 20 years back, all these corrosive ingestion patients used to come more with the esophageal strictures and very less gastric outlet obstruction or very less stomach injuries. But nowadays, maybe in last 10 years, more of the patients are coming with significant stomach injury as compared to esophageal injury. So any comment on that?
Data on 200 plus patients, 35% had isolated esophageal injury, 30% had isolated gastric injury, and 35% had isolated gastric injury. So overall 65% of patients had gastric injury, overall 60% had esophageal injury. Why is it so difficult to answer? But yes, this observation is correct. Maybe that patients with gastric injury earlier were straight away going for surgery. Now, with the advent of balloon dilatation and wide experience with that, they reach us.
Effective is injecting steroids in the esophageal stricture for subsequent management. And the second is, as we have mentioned about gastric outlet obstructions, what size of balloons usually and how many dilatations they require. Because we have to balance the cost also along with testing medications are not affording also that particular class. So how many sessions you really require for saying that finally we have good dilatation, and the role of steroid in managing these strictures?
Gastric dilatation after 8 weeks. There are patients, young ladies, 18 years, 20 years, who who come to you within 2 weeks. So we started doing early dilatation within 2 weeks, but that needed to be done twice a week. So you'll do it every 3 days, and they required a total of about 9 to 11 sessions. But they would avoid surgery. So they needed to be dilated with the smaller balloon 6 millimeter onwards. A patient who comes with 8 to 10 weeks later can be started on 8 to 10 millimeter balloon. But first sitting with 6 or 8 millimeters has to be repeated twice, and unless you are sure that there is no bleeding, the balloon is safely being expanded, you gradually increase the diameter and the end point remains 15 millimeter. Steroid injection, because of shortage of time I did not show that data. About half of patients of corrosive esophageal injury are refractory. Refractory means they do not reach 15 millimeters in 5 dilatations. About 65% are recurrent. That means you dilate to 15 and still they will come back with strictures. These are the groups of patients who require steroid injection, either refractory or recurrent. So on the whole, about 2/3 of our patients at PGI have been treated with steroids. Steroids decrease the need for subsequent dilatation, or you can say the frequency of dilatation is reduced. It does not avoid dilatation, but it reduces it from once in 2 months to once in 4 months. That is what it does on a long-term basis. So refractory or recurrent strictures should be treated with steroid injection.
So will you prefer PPI in both the cases of corrosive alkali or acid burn?
Yes, I did mention that in healing the ulceration and probably preventing stricture formation. So if the patient, for all gastric injury, we give sucralfate. Esophagus, we do not know whether it matters or not, but for stomach, sucralfate. PPIs, as I said, that patients who have stricture at the lower end of esophagus will have hypochlorhydria or achlorhydria. They do not require PPIs. There is no acid to be reduced. So, if at all, anything which may help is sucralfate.
Two clarifications. One is the relook endoscopy at day 5. Because what textbook teaching was, don't go in for an endoscopy beyond 72 hours. So, one is what you are shown beautifully is the downstaging. What about 3B? The injuries, 3B injuries, do we require a CT at day 1, or we also wait for day 5 for a CT? Because we are downstaging those also, we're waiting for them. So I needed some clarification of this relook endoscopy.
CT scan also shows you grade 3 injury, then such a patient should not be managed conservatively, should be subjected to surgery. 3A and less, you place in nasoentral tube or wait for day 5. If the injury is downgraded, whatever, at that time you place a nasojejunal tube on day 5.
And the second question is, what is the protocol for the endoscopy following the initial endoscopy? That is it the 4-week, that is when we have injuries beyond 2 weeks, we have to do a relook endoscopy? Is it 4 weeks or 6 weeks? Then
if you can wait to 6 to 8 weeks is the time when the fear of perforation with dilatation is the least. For first 6 weeks there is the process of fibrosis has not set in completely. So you delay it by 6 to 8 weeks.
6 weeks is the minimum.
My question is about the surgery. In grade 3B, what are the outcome in our experience?
Had mortality of 70%. Those who had surgery within the first 1 week, first 3 days particularly, their mortality was 50%. So the only chance of survival in these patients is if you do surgery as early as possible.
So surgery include the colon conduit and with anastomosis?
No, at that time it is first is just removing the esophagus and stomach. Everything else is later.
2 steps.